An elderly veteran woman stumbled in the palace crowd, her medals catching the sunlight as she nearly fell. And that's when the impossible happened. One royal guard suddenly broke protocol, stepping off his mark to catch her. The courtyard froze in silence, until what the crowd did next turned that breach of tradition into something unforgettable. A royal guard, trained to remain motionless under any circumstance, suddenly broke protocol. He stepped forward, steadied her by the arm, and whispered just 5 words that silenced the entire forecourt. "You're safe, ma'am. Stand tall." The tourists who had been laughing moments earlier froze, phones trembling in their hands. And when the woman revealed she had once worn the same uniform herself, the crowd's response turned that breach of protocol into something nobody there would ever forget. Now, before we reveal the full story, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, Guard Focus, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The first breath of autumn carried that particular London crispness, cool enough to see your breath, sharp enough to make you pull your coat closer, but not yet cold enough to thin the crowds. By mid-morning, Buckingham Palace's forecourt was already thick with tourists. School groups clustered together in matching high-vis jackets, snapping photos with disposable cameras, while their teachers tried in vain to keep order. Families leaned against the black railings, holding up phones and pointing toward the scarlet flashes of uniform in the courtyard. Veterans, their medals catching the pale sunlight, mingled quietly among the crowd, here for reasons far less casual than a tourist photograph. Lance Corporal Thomas Whitaker stood at his ceremonial post near the South Arch. His figure was striking, scarlet tunic perfectly pressed, tall black bearskin towering over his lean frame, rifle angled with mathematical precision against his shoulder. At 28, he had mastered the art of immobility. The white gloves on his hands might as well have been carved from stone. His gaze was locked forward, fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, neither seeing nor acknowledging the hundreds of eyes fixed on him. But beneath the stillness, he was not empty. No guard ever was. Whitaker had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories. The old man had fought in North Africa during the Second World War, a tank driver who carried sand in his boots long after he came home. He had spoken rarely of the battles themselves, but often of the men, comrades who had held the line, who had stood for something when standing was all that remained. "You never leave someone to stand alone," he'd say, his voice gravelly with memory. That phrase became the compass of Whitaker's life. It was why he joined the Guards, why he learned to hold his body rigid for hours on end, why he endured heat, cold, rain, and mockery without a word. Every second of silence was a kind of tribute, not only to the king and country, but to the man who had taught him what service meant. The morning ceremony unfolded like clockwork. Boots struck stone in perfect rhythm. Rifles gleamed as the sun shifted through patches of grey and light. Tourists murmured in awe at the spectacle. A few children shouted nonsense toward the guards, hoping to coax a smile. A young man in a hoodie performed exaggerated marches behind the rope line, prompting laughter from his friends. These were familiar provocations. The guards absorbed them without a flicker, as unyielding as the palace walls themselves. But not everyone in the crowd came for laughs. Near the centre, leaning against the railing, was a woman who carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew exactly what those uniforms meant. She must have been in her late 70s, perhaps 80. Her posture was slightly stooped, her hand resting heavily on a polished wooden walking stick. But her coat drew the eye more than her cane. Pinned to the breast were 3 medals, faded ribbons, carefully polished metal, each one catching the pale sun as if unwilling to be forgotten. Some of the younger tourists glanced at them with curiosity before turning away. They didn't recognize the significance. But Whitaker did. Out of the corner of his eye, in that peripheral vision guards honed to a razor's edge, he saw her standing firm despite the shifting crowd around her. She was not loud. She was not jostling for the best view. She simply stood, lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the guards as if seeing something beyond the pageantry, something remembered. Whitaker's breath remained steady, his chest rising and falling in the same disciplined rhythm. But inside, there was a flicker of recognition. That bearing, that pride in medals, that stubborn presence. It reminded him of his grandfather on Remembrance Sundays, standing straighter than his age should have allowed, hat clutched at his chest. Around them, the forecourt pulsed with the life of the city. The clatter of horse hooves on the cobblestones as a mounted officer passed. The chatter of school children pointing out rifles, bearskins and bayonets. The constant shuffle of tourists pressing forward for a clearer photo. A man with a camera balanced precariously on the rail tried to angle above the crowd, only to be told off by a steward. And yet, through the noise and the crush, the woman with the medals held her ground. Whitaker noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she leaned harder on her cane. He noticed, too, the way the crowd sometimes shifted against her without apology, treating her like another obstacle between themselves and their perfect holiday shot. He did not move. He could not. That was the job. But he saw, and though his eyes remained forward, his mind recorded the details in silence. Two teenagers edged closer, whispering and laughing, daring each other to shout something at the guards. One cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Bet you can't blink, mate! What happens if a fly lands on your nose?" Laughter followed. A few in the crowd chuckled, others frowned. The woman with the medals didn't flinch, her eyes still locked on the scarlet line. Whitaker's jaw tightened just slightly, the only crack in the mask of stillness. He had heard every insult under the sun hurled at his regiment. But this morning, with that elderly woman watching, with her medals glinting like echoes of history, the taunts seemed to carry a sharper disrespect. And though he stood as still as stone, something deep within him began to stir, an awareness that today's ceremony might not end as every other one had. The woman in the dark coat stood with quiet steadiness, medals pinned proudly just below her collarbone. There was something deliberate about the way she had arranged herself that morning, as though she'd prepared not just for an outing, but for a vigil. The cane helped her balance, but it was clear the effort of standing was heavy. Even so, she refused to lean too much on it. Her hair, silver white and tightly pinned back, framed a face lined with years of service and sacrifice. Every so often, she would reach up and touch the top medal with two fingers, almost absent-mindedly, like someone recalling the weight of memory. Those near her noticed it too, whispering, "She must have served." Others shrugged, more interested in their phones than in history. The crowd thickened as the hour wore on. Tourists pressed forward, voices rising in different languages. A family with 3 young children squeezed into a gap just beside the woman, their excitement spilling over into restless movement. One of the boys brushed against her arm without noticing, sending her cane wobbling. She steadied herself quickly, but the brief stumble drew a sympathetic glance from a man nearby. Nobody offered more than that. The teenagers who had been jeering earlier drifted closer. There were 3 of them now, lanky figures in designer trainers, speaking in half-shouted tones to make sure people heard their jokes. One mimicked the guard's stiff posture, holding his phone out like a rifle. Another pretended to faint dramatically against the rail, calling out, "Oi, guard, you gonna save me?" The laughter was sharp, intrusive, carrying further than it should have. It was in moments like these that discipline mattered most. Whitaker remained motionless, every muscle locked. His breathing remained even, but through the corner of his vision, he could see the woman's shoulders tighten. She hadn't come for spectacle, she had come for respect. And now, surrounded by mockery, she was being denied even the simple dignity of standing in peace. Her hand shook slightly as she adjusted her grip on the cane. This time, she leaned heavier on it, her knuckles whitening. Behind her, a group of tourists from overseas pushed closer to the rail for photographs. The woman swayed as their elbows brushed against her back. One of the medals shifted on its ribbon and clinked softly against another. Still, she didn't complain, didn't speak. She simply braced herself, jaw set, eyes locked on the scarlet line of guards across the courtyard. Whitaker's thoughts turned unbidden to his grandfather's Remembrance Day marches. He remembered helping the old man pin his medals to his blazer, watching how the weight of them seemed to straighten his back despite the pain of age. "Never leave a comrade standing alone," his grandfather's voice echoed in memory. And here she was, a woman who had clearly stood in service before, who had borne weight that few could understand, now standing alone in a crowd, more interested in amusement than remembrance. The teenagers grew louder. One called out, "Bet he's not even allowed to scratch his nose. What a joke!" Another added, "Don't blink, soldier boy. We'll catch you on TikTok." People laughed nervously. Some shook their heads. Others lifted phones, eager to capture what they thought might be a viral moment. The atmosphere shifted toward mockery, and the woman with the cane became caught in the middle of it, pressed tighter into the rail, jostled without care, her space shrinking with every minute. Whittaker could do nothing. At least that was what his training demanded. Guards are statues. Guards do not interfere unless threatened directly. His orders were to remain unbroken, unbending, no matter the provocation. But every instinct he carried, every word his grandfather had spoken, pulled in the opposite direction. His eyes stayed fixed forward, but his awareness of her grew sharper by the second. He noted how her breathing had become shallower, how her shoulders trembled slightly as she tried to keep her balance. He noticed the way she angled herself to protect the medals on her chest, as though guarding them from the careless crush of the crowd. A man nearby muttered under his breath, "Someone ought to help her." But he didn't move. Nobody did. And still the crowd pressed. The children beside her grew restless, bumping against her leg. A tourist with a heavy camera bag turned too quickly and clipped her cane. She staggered again, catching herself just before she might have fallen. This time, several in the crowd gasped, a ripple of unease cutting through the laughter. But the teenagers only grinned wider. "Careful, Gran," one of them mocked. "Don't fall. Maybe the guard will catch you." Whittaker's jaw clenched so tightly he felt it in his ears. His rifle remained steady at his shoulder, his boots fixed to the stone. But inside, something was shifting. The weight of stillness was becoming unbearable, the sense that protocol demanded silence while dignity was being eroded before his very eyes. He thought of the parades his grandfather had stood through, medals gleaming in November rain. He thought of the words, "Never leave a comrade standing alone." And as the elderly woman's hand slipped slightly down her cane again, he knew that a choice was coming. One that might cost him discipline, perhaps even punishment, but some rules weighed less than the one written deep inside him. The crowd laughed again, oblivious. The tourists pressed closer, and Whittaker, though perfectly still, had already decided. If she fell, he would not stand silent. The line between duty and honour was narrowing with each breath. It happened quickly, the way important moments often do. One tourist, a man in his 30s with a backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, was weaving his way forward through the mass of people, impatient to get a clearer photo. He muttered apologies without slowing, using his elbows to create space. When he reached the railing, his bag swung wide, catching the elderly woman's cane just as she shifted her weight. The cane slipped. It struck the cobblestones with a hollow crack, skittering sideways, and for a split second she stood unbalanced, medals gleaming, lips parted in shock as her body swayed backward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A schoolgirl shrieked. The tourists closest to her reached out instinctively, but none fast enough. In that instant, it was clear she might collapse. And that was when Lance Corporal Thomas Whittaker moved. For the crowd, it was like seeing a statue come alive. One moment he was rigid, motionless, indistinguishable from the other guards in scarlet and bearskin. The next, his boot struck the stone with a deliberate step forward, breaking centuries of drilled immobility in a single motion. The air itself seemed to change. Phones shot upward like a forest of periscopes. Fingers hit record. Parents whispered urgently to their children. The silence that followed his movement was heavier than the earlier laughter, an almost reverent hush, broken only by the shuffle of boots as Whittaker strode across the few paces that separated him from the fallen cane. With steady precision, he bent, picked up the walking stick, and turned to the elderly woman. She had managed to grip the railing, keeping herself upright, but her face was pale, her breath shallow. Whitaker offered the cane back with one gloved hand, his other hand gently steadying her elbow. His voice, low, controlled, but filled with unmistakable respect, carried clearly to those nearest. "You're safe, ma'am. Please, stand tall." The effect was electric. The laughter stopped instantly. The teenagers, caught mid-grin, froze with open mouths. Tourists who had lifted phones to mock now trembled, realizing they were witnessing something altogether different. The woman looked at Whitaker, her eyes brimming. She took the cane, fingers trembling, and held his gaze with a steadiness that belied her years. Then, in a voice cracked but clear, she said, "I wore this uniform too once, and I buried my husband in it." The words struck like a bell, resonating across the courtyard. Those nearby heard them first, then repeated them softly, the phrase spreading like a current through the packed crowd, until even those at the back knew what had been said. "I wore this uniform too." It reframed everything. The frail, elderly woman was no longer just a visitor in need of help. She was part of the same tradition, the same unbroken line of service that Whitaker now stood within. Her medals gleamed more brightly in that instant, and every veteran in the crowd seemed to straighten unconsciously, as though acknowledging a comrade. Whitaker did not speak again. His duty forbade speeches, explanations, or ceremony beyond the smallest gestures. But his hand, still lightly steadying her elbow, communicated more than words could. He ensured she was balanced, her cane firmly back beneath her grip, before stepping back one pace. The crowd's silence deepened. A baby whimpered before being hushed. The teenagers lowered their phones, suddenly ashamed. Even the restless schoolchildren stood straighter, their teachers wide-eyed. Every camera caught it. The soldier who moved, the woman with medals, the exchange of words that pierced through ceremony into something far more human. But even those who filmed did so with restraint now, aware that they were not capturing entertainment but memory. The woman lifted her chin, steadier now. She touched her medals once more, then looked Whitaker directly in the eye. Her lips shaped the words, "Thank you," though her voice was too soft for most to hear. He gave the faintest nod in reply, so subtle that only those directly in front could have caught it, and then, as if the spell had not yet broken, he stepped back onto his ceremonial mark. The transformation was startling. In a heartbeat, the man who had moved with such deliberate care became again a statue in scarlet and black, posture perfect, rifle set, gaze forward. To anyone arriving late, it would have seemed as though nothing had happened at all. But to everyone present, the air was different. The chatter and jeers that had filled the forecourt earlier were gone. In their place hung a quiet reverence, an awareness that they had seen something protocol alone could never explain. The elderly woman stood taller now, cane in place, shoulders squared as if bolstered by the exchange. She glanced once at the teenagers, who immediately lowered their eyes. A small smile touched her lips, not of triumph, but of dignity reclaimed. From somewhere deep in the crowd, a man whispered, "She buried her husband in that uniform." Another replied, "And he broke protocol for her." The moment had been sealed. Dozens of phones still filmed, but the tone of the recordings had shifted. No one was laughing. No one was mocking. What they were capturing was history of a smaller, more intimate kind. The kind that travels not through headlines, but through stories told quietly at dinner tables and in veterans' halls. And in the middle of it all stood Thomas Whitaker, silent once more, a living statue who had shown just enough humanity to remind them all what the uniform really meant. For a long moment, the forecourt seemed suspended, hundreds of people holding their breath, all eyes fixed on the guard who had broken the sacred stillness. Then the ripple began. It started with a small cluster of veterans near the front. They had been standing quietly together, caps tucked under their arms, coats heavy with medals of their own. One by one they straightened, heels clicking instinctively together. Without a word, they raised their hands in salute, sharp, deliberate, the kind of salute that carries weight because it is not given lightly. The gesture spread. A middle-aged man in the second row, his blazer marked with a poppy pin, placed a hand over his heart. A young father lifted his son onto his shoulders and whispered, "Watch closely." This is respect. The boy, perhaps no older than 6, raised a shaky little salute of his own. The change in the crowd was profound. Phones lowered slowly, almost guiltily, as though recording now felt intrusive. Tourists, who had been ready to laugh minutes earlier, were suddenly still, their eyes darting between the elderly woman with medals and the guard who had moved for her. Even the school children who had been restless moments before stood straighter, their teachers pressing fingers to their lips to preserve the hush. The woman herself adjusted her coat with trembling fingers, her medals catching the pale sunlight once more. Then, with surprising steadiness, she lifted her chin and stood taller, the way she must have stood decades earlier when the medals were first pinned. A child's voice carried from the crowd, high and curious. "Daddy, is she a hero too?" The father's reply came softly, but many heard it anyway. "Yes, she's a hero too." Whitaker remained in position, rifle at shoulder, eyes fixed forward as though the moment belonged to the air around him rather than to him personally. But his jaw relaxed slightly, enough to show that he had registered the words. It was at this point that the authority figure arrived. From the archway at the edge of the forecourt, Captain James Reynolds strode forward, his ceremonial sash crisp against his dark uniform. He had been briefed by staff that one of the guards moved, and his pace carried both urgency and tension. Protocol was clear. A guard breaking rank during duty was no small matter. The crowd parted instinctively, allowing Reynolds through. His boots struck sharp against the cobblestones as he approached Whitaker. He halted a pace away, voice low but firm. "Lance Corporal Whitaker," he said, just loud enough to carry to those nearest. "You stepped off post." The words hung heavy, as though they might undo the reverence that had settled over the courtyard. A murmur passed through the front rows, tourists and veterans alike, holding their breath to see what would follow. Whitaker did not move, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Silence was his only reply. Then Reynolds's gaze shifted. He looked at the elderly woman, at the medals on her chest, at the way she now stood straighter with the guard's cane steady in her hand. For a long moment, he took in the sight. The saluting veterans, the hushed children, the tearful eyes in the crowd. His expression softened, almost imperceptibly. He drew a breath and spoke again, his voice lower this time. "Noted," he said. Then, turning slightly toward the woman, "Thank you for your service, ma'am." It was simple, but it was enough. The crowd exhaled collectively, the tension breaking into a quiet kind of relief. The veterans lowered their salutes with solemn precision. Parents explained in hushed tones to their children what they had just seen. The atmosphere felt less like a tourist attraction now, and more like a service of remembrance. Whitaker, still frozen in stance, allowed himself one final gesture before silence reclaimed him. With the smallest movement of his head, a fraction of a bow, he acknowledged the elderly woman. She did not hesitate. Despite the cane in her left hand, she raised her right hand in return and delivered a crisp salute. It was not perfect. Her fingers shook slightly, her arm wavered with age. But the intent was unmistakable. The response was immediate. Applause began. Not raucous, not the noisy cheering of a sports crowd, but a steady, rolling wave of clapping that grew and spread with solemn weight. It carried not entertainment, but gratitude. People clapped slowly at first, palms meeting softly, then louder, more deliberate. Veterans joined in, standing tall. Tourists wiped their eyes without embarrassment. Children clapped because their parents did, but the seriousness in the air kept even their voices hushed. It was applause that felt ceremonial, as though it belonged not to the guard or even the woman, but to the moment itself, to what had been remembered, acknowledged, and preserved. Reynolds stood silently beside Whitaker for a moment longer, then gave a single nod and stepped back. He knew discipline required him to mark what had happened, but he also knew tradition demanded he let it stand unchallenged. The woman lowered her salute slowly, her hand brushing the edge of her medals. She whispered something, though only those closest could hear. He would have been proud. Whether she meant her husband, or perhaps all those she had known, nobody asked. Whitaker did not react. He had returned fully to his stillness, rifle firm against his shoulder, eyes locked forward. But for the rest of the crowd, the meaning was clear. They had witnessed not just ceremony, but humanity. And that was something they would carry far longer than the photographs they had come to take. The applause swelled for a time, rolling like a tide across the forecourt, before softening into silence once more. It wasn't the kind of silence born of awkwardness or expectation. It was the stillness of people who knew they had just witnessed something they would not forget. Whitaker stood unmoving, returned now to his post, scarlet tunic and bearskin, restoring the image of ceremonial perfection. Yet those who looked closely no longer saw just a guard on duty. They saw the man who had chosen to act when humanity outweighed protocol, a figure who carried both discipline and compassion in equal measure. The elderly woman remained at the railing for a few minutes longer, her breathing steadier now. She leaned lightly on her cane, but stood straighter than she had all morning. At her side, a woman in her 40s appeared, a daughter, perhaps, or granddaughter, making her way through the crowd with concern etched on her face. She touched the veteran's shoulder gently. "Are you all right, Mum?" she asked, voice low. The older woman nodded. "I'm fine, love, better than fine." Her eyes flicked once more to Whitaker, still standing rigid, and she smiled faintly. "I just needed to see them stand, and I needed to stand with them." The daughter adjusted her arm around her mother's back, helping her step away from the rail. What happened next was remarkable in its simplicity. The crowd parted for them. Tourists who moments before had been jostling for the best view now stepped aside, giving her space as though she were royalty herself. Some murmured "thank you" as she passed. Others bowed their heads. A young man touched the brim of his cap in quiet salute. Children mimicked the gesture of the veterans, raising clumsy little salutes with hands not yet trained in precision. Parents didn't laugh. They allowed it, recognizing the seriousness that hung in the air. One teacher guided her school group into silence, whispering to them about what respect meant. The woman walked slowly, every step steady with her daughter's support, her medals glinting against her dark coat. Behind her, the crowd remained hushed, watching her leave as if closing a chapter of living history. And at the heart of it all, Whitaker did not move. His rifle remained against his shoulder, his boots locked against the stone. The sun caught the edge of his white belt, throwing a glimmer of light across the courtyard. He stared forward into that fixed middle distance, just as he had been trained to do. But in the eyes of the hundreds watching, he was no longer just another scarlet figure in the line. He was the man who had reminded them that tradition was not theatre, but sacrifice. No more jeers came. No more mocking challenges. Even the children who usually called out to make the guards laugh stayed silent, sensing instinctively that the rules had changed. Phones slipped back into pockets. The restless hum of chatter was replaced by something gentler. Whispered exchanges about service, about family, about what it meant to wear a uniform. A boy near the front tugged on his father's sleeve. "Did you see that?" The soldier moved. The father knelt to his son's height, his voice firm. He didn't just move, he showed us what honour looks like. The boy thought about that, then looked back at the still figure of Whitaker. His salute was awkward, too quick, but earnest, and this time nobody corrected him. From the far side of the forecourt, the elderly woman turned one last time. She lifted her hand to her brow, one final salute offered across the distance. Whether Whittaker saw it, none could tell. He remained frozen, discipline restored, but the crowd noticed. Many saluted with her. When she finally disappeared into the flow of people beyond the gates, the atmosphere lingered. Heavy, reverent, like incense that clings to the air long after the flame has gone out. Whittaker remained as he had been at dawn, silent, immovable, disciplined. Yet every person who left the forecourt carried something different home with them. They no longer saw the guards as tourist attractions to be mocked or challenged. They had seen the humanity beneath the bearskin, the tradition carried in scarlet wool, the silent oath that sometimes demanded more than stillness. And so the courtyard returned to ceremony. The boots would march again, the rifles gleam, the tourists crowd. But those who had been there that morning knew they had witnessed something not written in protocol, yet etched into memory. In the end, that was enough. Would you have done the same thing if you were in his boots? Broken protocol to help her? And what would you have felt, standing in that crowd, seeing the guard and the veteran salute each other? Make sure to like this video if the moment moved you, and subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Share it with someone who still believes honour matters. Other Royal Guard stories are on your screen right now. Watch them next, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with a brand new one.